Hi, this is Jeannie Hebert Brown, and I am continuing my social work saga. This is chapter 4. In June of 1966, I graduated with a bachelor's in American Studies from George Washington University. I had considered the idea of going into social work, but in discussing it with friends, I felt like I would be too soft-hearted and I would be uncomfortable working with people who had serious social problems. I didn't realize that I was going to be able to set limits and boundaries about this at the time. I saw myself as being unhappy or upset with a social work job. While I was at GW, I had volunteered in the local elementary school, and I ended up teaching art. My mother had been an elementary school art teacher, and my grandmother had been a high school teacher who taught Latin, German, and mathematics. So I always kind of had the idea that I would end up being a teacher too. But the school politics and the lack of ability to be creative as a teacher dissuaded me from teaching. I was pretty much an anti-government person at that juncture, so I didn't want to go and work for the government. And then I thought of working in social work, but through the auspices of the church. The church I went to in DC was very innovative, and it did a lot of community involvement. I volunteered with the church program to teach literacy in the DC jail, and I also did home visits to a man who had lost his wife and was trying to care for his young daughter and was very depressed and unhappy. So I decided that if I were going to go to graduate school in theology and work through the church, basically doing social work through the church, I may as well go for the gusto. So I applied to Harvard and Duke, and I got into Harvard. I suppose it was mainly because of diversity. There weren't very many women students. They even gave me some money to defray the costs. I found a small second-floor apartment in Cambridge in a house that had a little old lady in it, Miriam, and I moved there. The school was fantastic, very interesting, dynamic, intellectually stimulating. The students were so nice, so supportive, but I was in way over my head academically. I really wasn't interested in spending all my time at the library, which is what you had to do if you were going to keep up with the classes. In one class, we were writing papers about Schleiermacher, who I had never heard of. Another class was going a hermeneutical study of a verse in the book of John, or Mark. I can't even remember. It was fascinating, but it was too much for me. I took a class in ethical considerations, and that was really interesting. We were helping a company. They were building an office in Boston, and there was a big old tree in the way of their building, and they were trying to decide whether they were going to destroy the tree or build their office around the tree. And they hired this little cadre of students from Harvard to help them make this decision. I also volunteered in the psych ward at Mass General Hospital. I didn't do much there. I just sat around and talked with the patients, but I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the chance to say something that wasn't just small talk. Being able to talk with something at a different level. Meanwhile, back in D.C., I had started dating another man who was not good for me, but I thought I loved him. I would fly back and forth between Boston and Washington on student standby, and we would see each other on the weekends. He was a year younger than me, and so he hadn't graduated yet. It was really quite romantic flying back and forth, and since we only saw each other for a couple of days on the weekend, we got along pretty well. My parents met him, and they did not like him at all. So when we decided to get married, my parents refused to help with a wedding. So I ended up pulling together a little ceremony in Washington with a luncheon at my now mother-in-law's apartment. So I married this wrong man and dropped out of school. He had a high draft number, so he decided he would join the Navy, the submarine service, because none of the rivers in Vietnam were deep enough for submarines. So he figured he'd be safe. Eventually, he got stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, and then I joined him there. I put myself on the civil service list, and I got a job working for the Department of Public Welfare in Chesapeake, Virginia. Now, Chesapeake, Virginia is the home of the Dismal Swamp. It's one of the largest counties because of land area, because of the swamp, in the United States. Going into the Dismal Swamp was like going back in time. There were lots of slave cabins, and people lived in them and worked on the farms. Meanwhile, back at the social work office, each worker was given 2 filing cabinets, one for your colored clients and one for your white clients. And the colored clients, they were all called by their first name, Billy Bob or Jimmy Joe. And then the white clients were called with a courtesy title, Miss or Mrs. The colored clients went to substandard schools, and in the spring and summer, they did not get food stamps because the welfare department decided they could grow their own food. I was providing birth control information for my clients, and my boss, Patricia Warren, called me into her office and said that I could not do that because Southern women never discuss such a topic. Well, I thought it was important. Then I joined the Welfare Rights Organization. I thought I ought to find out if my clients were getting everything that they deserved. But there was somebody there who saw me and told the boss of the whole agency that I was there. And so he called me into his office and told me that he was going to be moving me to something that he thought I would be best suited for, and that was writing up step-parent adoptions. I had no idea that white people could be so prejudiced. I understood that there was prejudice. I knew when people made disparaging remarks about anybody who didn't look like them, wasn't in the way that they thought the person should be. I understood that. But I never knew it was so deeply ingrained or so subtle. I was in a carpool with Patricia, and one day we got into a huge fight because she told me that all colored people have the same accent. They're born with it. And I said, no, I'd gone to college in New England with black kids from Maine and New Hampshire, and they had a Maine and a New Hampshire accent, not a Southern accent. But she would not believe me, so I just gave up. The Northerners and the Westerners who were stationed in Norfolk because of the Vietnam War drifted together, and I made some lovely friends, several of whom I'm still in touch with today. One of them I speak to every month. Oddly enough, one of the agency's social workers asked if I would run a mother's group with her in a low-income housing project owned by Douglas Fertilizer. It was a real company store where everyone lived on the property, worked for Douglas, bought their food at the company store and their goods. All the residents were black. I was thrilled at the opportunity to run a group. The woman had a protocol where she would ask the mothers to present a problem, and then each mother would give her idea of the solution to the problem. And then the other social worker, who really ran the group, she would pick out the idea she thought was best and healthiest, and then she would go back to that mother and try to get her to expound on that, and we would discuss that. And it was a really good group. I enjoyed myself. I enjoyed doing it. She was very subtle in her way of finding the most correct answer. At home, I was reading books on psychological issues, and I happened to read Between Parent and Child by Haim Ginott, and that book changed my life. It espoused the way that I wanted to talk to other people, the way I thought people should communicate, the way I thought we should communicate in my marriage. Haim Ginott was a clinical psychologist, a child therapist, and a parent educator. He developed a philosophy of communication based on respect, empathy, and emotional validation. He called it congruent communication, where the words and the feelings and the expectations all kind of line up without being confrontive. As an example, he might say, "You're permitted to use your books during this assignment, but you cannot use the internet." He would just lay it out, but not in a negative way. He focused on behavior, not criticism. Instead of saying, "John is disrupting this class," he would say, "Getting in and out of your seat disrupts the class." He advocated the use of I statements, which kept the focus on the speaker's feelings. And he focused on teaching acceptable behaviors rather than punishments. He wanted to explore emotions rather than deny them. There's a YouTube video. He died at the age of 51, in the 60s, I believe. But there are a couple of YouTube films of him talking and explaining his communication theory. It's very sweet. He had two students, Elaine Maslish and Adele Farber, and they continued his work, and they wrote a book called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. And it's a very famous book, and it does utilize Haim Ginott's theories. I was so excited about this communication style. I excitedly explained it to my husband, but it just ended up being something more for us to argue about.